Hey everybody, I am Chris Baker from LuckyGunner.com. Today I am going to show you how to mount an optic to your rifle. And then next time we are going to go out to the range and I'll show you how to sight in that optic. I am going to cover a lot of territory today, so I will leave timecode shortcuts in the description in case you want to skip around to the parts that are relevant for you. The main demo gun I am using is a Bravo Company AR-15 with a low power variable scope. Swamp Fox Optics kindly sent us this 1-to-10 power arrowhead scope to use for this video. Most of the procedures I will go through are going to be the same regardless of what gun or optic you might have. I will try to point out the cases where the steps are going to be a little different for things like bolt action rifles or red dot sights. Most of those differences will be today in the mounting instructions. When we get to the sighting in process, that's not going to change a whole lot from one setup to another. There are dozens of different ways to do just about everything I am going to show you. This is not necessarily the right way or the best way. It's just a way. My goal is to show you the simplest methods possible that will work for the majority of shooters. If you're wanting to get into something like long range precision shooting, that is a whole different ball game. Those guys do all kinds of crazy voodoo to their scopes and their mounts, and I cannot help you with that. For the rest of you, this method I'm about to show you will probably work. Before we get into actually mounting the scope, let's talk about scope rings and mounts for just a minute. Once you have put in a bunch of effort into researching and shopping for an optic, figuring out what kind of rings and mount you might need, it's often just an afterthought. It's not really the fun part of doing that research. But this hardware is super important. It deserves some serious attention. I have seen and experienced far more problems at the range that were due to bad mounts or improper installation than from shortcomings of the optics themselves. I am not going to walk you through all of the different options. You will have to research what kind of hardware makes the most sense for your optic and for your rifle and what you're planning to do with it. But I do want to hit a couple of important points that sometimes confuse people, especially when they're new to all of this. If you're using a red dot or some other kind of non-magnified optic, it probably comes with a mount. Most of the micro red dots like this one and the open emitter optics, they don't need scope rings. They just attach directly to the mount with screws. If that's what you have, you're actually going to be able to skip a whole bunch of the steps when we get to mounting the optic. The mount that comes with the red dot is probably fine for most shooters unless you need the optic to be at a different height or you want something like a quick detach feature. The factory mount is usually serviceable if the dot itself is a decent dot. Your red dot might actually come with two different mounts. Usually that would be a low mount and a high mount. The high mount is for AR style rifles. The low one is for pretty much everything else. Regardless of what gun or optic you have, it's usually helpful to understand the relationship between optic height and cheek weld. That is the spot where your stock contacts your cheek, usually just below your cheekbone. Most rifles and shotguns are designed so the comb of the stock, that's the top of the stock here, is on a slightly lower plane than the top of the receiver and the barrel. So when you rest your cheek on the stock, your eye is naturally in line with whatever is right on top of the receiver, the sights or the optic. Generally speaking, you want your red dot or your scope to be as low and as close to the receiver as you can get it. That'll help you maintain a solid cheek weld. A good cheek weld helps to make sure your eye goes to the same spot every time you get behind the rifle. If the stock is on your jaw or on your chin down here like that, it's a lot harder to be more consistent and your accuracy will usually suffer. With a magnified optic, the thing you have to look out for is you're trying to get it really low, but you don't want the bell, the objective bell, that is the part where the scope flares out up here at the objective end because it faces your objective. You don't want that to be touching the barrel. You want there to be a little gap in between there. So when you're choosing your scope rings, you generally want the lowest rings that still allow some clearance for your scope. If you have to get high rings in order to get that clearance, then you may have to add some kind of cheek riser to your stock in order to keep your eye in line with the scope when you have a good cheek weld. Now, AR-15s were designed with a buffer tube that is part of the action, and it's in line with the barrel. This tube can't really be moved. It can't go lower than the plane of the barrel, and the stock attaches to it. So that means when you rest your cheek on the stock of an AR, your eye is higher relative to the barrel and the receiver than it would be on other rifles. So the sighting system has to be higher as well. Most AR mounts will place the center of the optic about 1.5 inches above the receiver. Recently, a lot of people are gravitating toward the higher mounts. The 1.93 inch mounts in particular have an enthusiastic following. They were initially designed for shooting when you're wearing things like helmets and goggles and masks and you've got all this stuff in the way and you need the optic to be higher to be able to see your sights. But even without all that stuff, some shooters find the taller mounts allow them to maintain a more upright head position when they're standing. I have found those taller mounts are difficult to use when I'm in a prone position and I need a really solid cheek weld, but that's just me. It's kind of a preference thing. There's not necessarily a correct height for your optic. It really depends on your anatomical proportions and what you're going to be doing with the gun. Just be aware that it's a decision that you need to make on purpose, and you might need to experiment with a couple of different heights before you find what works for you and your equipment. One other point I will mention is about the quality and the cost of your scope mounting hardware. You can get a pair of cheap, lousy scope rings for 10 or 12 bucks, or you can spend $400 or more on a top shelf mount that will hold zero even if you chuck the rifle out of a helicopter. Choosing mounting hardware, it's kind of like choosing optics themselves. You pretty much never want the cheapest you can get. That's almost always garbage. But these days, you really don't have to spend a lot to get something that's pretty decent. The price jump from bad to acceptable is a lot shorter than the jump from acceptable to outstanding. So if you're looking at basic one-piece mounts, there are plenty of options in the $50 to $100 range that will work fine for the kind of shooting and the volume of shooting that most of us are doing. You might need to spend a little more if you're one of those precision long-range shooters that I mentioned. If your optic might get knocked around like in a duty or military context and your life is depending on it, or if you're shooting a cartridge with a whole lot of recoil, or if you're just doing a large volume of shooting like several thousand rounds a year, those all might be good reasons to look at a more premium mount. Today I am using this mount that Swamp Fox sent us with the Arrowhead scope. It's called the Independence mount, and it has an MSRP of 60 bucks. It is a one-piece mount, which means both rings are attached to the mount that's going to go on our Picatinny rail. I cannot vouch for this particular mount because I haven't used it yet, but we'll give it a try and see what happens. I am going to suggest 5 tools that you'll need to mount an optic. You can pull it off without any of these tools, but they will all make your life dramatically easier. The first is a rifle rest or a gun vise. Second, a torque driver in inch-pounds with appropriate bits. Third, a small bubble level like this one. Number 4, some thread locker. And number 5, a paint marker or some nail polish. You can usually improvise something for a rifle rest. There are a bunch of cheap ones that work just fine also. This is a fairly nice rest, and it's got some features that make it easier to work with than some of the cheaper ones I've used, but you don't have to have something like this. Really, a homemade or an inexpensive rest is great as long as it holds the rifle upright and level, and it keeps it from moving around while you're working on it. There is really no substitute for a torque driver. A lot of people get away without using one, but I personally refuse to mount an optic without one anymore. If you think you're going to mount more than a couple of scopes in your lifetime, this is a worthwhile investment, especially if you're doing magnified scopes like this one. The other stuff, the level, the thread locker, and the paint marker, those are all inexpensive and widely available, so there's really no reason not to have them when you're mounting a scope. Okay, let's start actually mounting this thing. The absolute first step is to clear the rifle, make sure it's not loaded. So I'm going to take it out of the rest here. I'm going to double check the chamber, physically inspect it, nothing in the mag well, and we're good. And of course, I am still going to keep it pointed in a safe direction. The next step is one you can actually skip if you are using an AR style rifle. For some other rifles, you will actually need to attach your scope base to the receiver. The base is the thing that your scope is gonna mount to or your rings attached to. Most ARs, as well as a lot of other modern semi-automatic rifles, have what's known as a 1913 mil standard Picatinny rail machined into the top of the receiver. These rails are compatible with a wide variety of accessories, including Picatinny compatible optics mounts. So if your rifle does not have a Picatinny rail or some other type of built-in scope base, you will have to add one before you mount anything. This Ruger bolt action is a good example. It's got a Picatinny rail, but this was added to the rifle. It's not part of the receiver. There are too many different types of scope bases and rails and things for me to go over how to mount all of them. It's usually pretty straightforward if you just follow the manufacturer's instructions. Just be aware that some rifles, especially older ones, might not be drilled and tapped to accept scope bases. That means you will have to consult a gunsmith if you really want to put an optic on that gun. Okay, assuming you already have some kind of rail or scope base, the first thing I'm going to do is just place my mount on top of the receiver. And I don't know exactly where I want it to be right now, so I'm just going to put it as far back as it will go. And then I will very lightly tighten down the bolts here. I am not torquing down on it. I just don't want it jiggling around on me while I am trying to experiment with it. Next, I am going to remove the top half of the rings, and I've got my little tool that came with my optic, and this is probably something we'll fast forward through so you don't have to watch it all. Once you get those screws out, just set the screws aside somewhere safe along with the rings. You're not going to need those for a couple of minutes. Okay, there are two main priorities to keep in mind when you are positioning the scope on the mount. The first is eye relief. That is the distance from the eyepiece to your eyeball. The second is the cant of the scope, the side-to-side rotation of it. So before we tighten the rings down, we're going to make sure this thing is level relative to the rifle itself. So I'm just going to place the scope here on the lower half of the rings for the time being, just to get a rough idea of where it's going to be front to back. Proper eye relief is different for every individual and for every scope. However, I happen to know that for scopes similar to this one, I typically like the eyepiece to be somewhere around where the castle nut is. That tends to be about the correct placement for me. So I am actually going to move the mount because I can't get it that far forward at this point. So I've got to loosen these screws a little bit, and I'm going to place the mount a couple of slots forward on the receiver. Let's try right there. There, that's closer to where I want it to be, and I've still got plenty of room. I can move it forward or back. One of the advantages of a cantilever style mount like this one, where the front ring is way out in front of the mount itself, is that I can get the mount farther forward without going onto the handguard. This might all look like one continuous rail, but the handguard is actually a separate piece from the receiver. So these two rails are not perfectly in line. They're slightly canted. I actually checked them with the level earlier, and they're not exactly on the same plane. So if I were to have two scope rings and one of them's on the receiver and one of them's on the handguard, or if I had one of the bolts from my mount here and the other one was here, that's going to affect my zero. It might cause my point of aim to shift when I'm shooting the gun, and we really don't want that. So unless you happen to have a receiver where the handguard is all one piece, which is not most of them, you want to make sure that your mount is all over the receiver side and not over onto the handguard. Now, if I was using rings in this case, I would not be quite up on the handguard. I would be safe putting it right here and have the same placement. But sometimes you need your eye relief to be a little farther forward, and that's when these types of mounts are super helpful. Now that the mount is roughly where I want it to be, I will go ahead and apply some thread locker to the screws. Even though I am not going to torque them down just yet, I want to go ahead and put that thread locker on there. I prefer purple Loctite 222. It is specifically designed for screws under 1/4 inch in diameter. Blue Loctite is also a popular option. I've had it work just fine, but what I've noticed is that if I ever have to take the screws out, that old dried up blue Loctite is a lot harder to clean up than old dried up purple Loctite. So I'm just going to put a little on each screw. Now I should mention, if you don't know how to even guess where your eye relief is going to be, don't worry about that. We're going to check it in a minute. If that's the case for you, I would not put the Loctite on the screws yet. I would wait until you have a general idea that you're at least not going to want to move the mount again. But I'm pretty sure I'm not going to move mine, so I went ahead and Loctited the screws. Now I'm going to lightly tighten each screw. And again, I'm not torquing down on them. I basically want to get the scope so that it is not loosely moving around when I pick up the rifle, but I also want to be able to move it and adjust it to where it needs to be so I can set my eye relief. So I am adjusting these screws in kind of an X pattern. I'll do like top right, bottom left, top left, bottom right, so that at the end, the gap in between the top ring and bottom ring is equal on both sides. And I also want to tighten gradually the back and the front so I don't have one side completely tight without any tension on the other side. That might be overly cautious, but it certainly doesn't hurt. We don't want the rings to be touching, even though it might look like the top and bottom are touching, and sometimes there should be a tiny gap in there. If they're touching, it's usually because one side's touching and there's a big gap on the other side, and that's not good. Or both sides are touching because we have just cranked way down and put way too much torque on those screws. That's also not good. If you torque these screws down too much, you can actually crush the scope body. That would be bad, so don't do that. So I'm just going to keep gradually tightening the front a little bit, and then I'll do the rear a little bit until the scope is not quite so easy to move. Okay, that's about what I want there. I can move the scope around manually, but if I pick up the rifle, it doesn't just slide back and forth. That's good. Now, some shooters will insist on having the adjustment dials so they're perfectly centered in between the two scope rings. That's really just an aesthetic thing, though. Functionally, it doesn't matter if the dials are in the center. Now, I admit I like it when it's centered, but if it's not, the eye relief is the more important thing, not what the scope looks like. Okay, now I can check my eye relief. With a variable magnification scope, the eye relief is more sensitive at the higher magnification levels, so I want to set my eye relief when the scope is on its highest magnification. This is a 1 to 10 power scope, so I'm going to crank it all the way up to 10. And now I'm going to take the rifle out of the mount, and I'm just going to shoulder it like I was going to shoot it. To pop my caps here. And I'm not aiming at anything in particular. A blank wall is actually ideal. I just want to see that I can see the whole field of view inside the reticle. I want a nice crisp circle all the way around the entire field of view. If it's blurry on the sides or there's a dark shadow on one side of the scope, I need to bring the eyepiece closer to my eye. If it's too close, then I will see a whole lot of black outside of the circle, and eventually I'll start seeing a second dark circle inside the field of view. Once I get it where I think I want it, I will lower the rifle and remount it a few times just to make sure my normal natural head position is getting proper eye relief. Get one a little closer than that. Yeah. All right, that looks pretty good. So if you are going to be shooting primarily from a bench or from prone or something like that, you want to do your eye relief. You want to check your eye relief in that position. I was doing it standing because it's easier to demonstrate that way. But your head position will change slightly depending on your shooting position, and that means your eye relief changes slightly. So if you're going to shoot from the bench most of the time, set your eye relief from a bench rest. If you're going to shoot from prone with a bipod, get out your bipod, get on the ground, and set your eye relief that way. If you're mounting a red dot or non-magnified optic instead of a scope, the eye relief is really not something you have to worry too much about. You can mount the dot all the way back at the charging handle, or you can stick it all the way up here on the handguard, and you'll probably be able to see it just fine. I tend to position the red dot based on how the gun balances. Usually I want it back here somewhere over the trigger guard, but that's just a matter of preference. Most people tend to like it somewhere in this range from the mag well to the trigger guard, but it really is just down to whatever you think is going to work for you. The red dots don't have nearly as sensitive eye relief as magnified scopes do. Okay, so the scope is about where I want it to be, so it's time for me to torque the mount to the rifle. So what I'm going to do first is actually loosen it just a little bit so that it has some play. Picatinny mounts usually have a bolt that goes through the slots on the rail. I want to push the mount as far forward as it goes so those bolts are touching the front of the rail. This is another one of those things that I'm not 100% sure is necessary, but I have heard it recommended enough times that I just do it every time now. At the very least, I don't think it can hurt anything. I don't usually use thread locker on the mount screws. They're much bigger than the ring screws, and we're going to torque them down pretty tight. I rarely have any issues with Picatinny mount screws coming loose. More often, I have had problems with the ring screws or with the little screws that will join red dot sights to their mounts. So now is when I need my torque driver. The proper amount of torque is different for every mount. Sometimes the instructions for the mount will indicate the proper torque. Sometimes you have to look that up on the company's website. And unfortunately, sometimes you just have to guess. Swamp Fox's website says to torque the Picatinny rails on this mount to 35 inch-pounds. So I will just set my torque driver to 35 inch-pounds. And I'm not sure if you can see that. That's on 35 now. When you reach the amount of torque that you have set, you will hear and feel a distinctive clicking sound. And on this particular torque driver, when you hit that click, that means you're there. You don't have to keep clicking down. You don't want to click, 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 click. It's just one click, and then I'm there. On this one, it's kind of weird to do it from this angle. That's it. That's 35 inch-pounds, and we're done with that part. Now, before we torque down the ring screws, we have to level the scope. And so that's what I've got my little bubble level for, but I can't just stick it on top of the turret and start checking the level. I first have to make sure the rifle is level. Now, this can get a little tricky. You have to find a flat spot where your level can fit. Now, again, I don't want to put it up here on the handguard because those are not on the same plane, and I can't put it here because it's not going to fit. Fortunately, I've got a little gap right here behind the mount and under the scope. And so now I'm going to adjust my rifle so that it is level. That looks pretty good there. So I'm going to tighten the rifle in the vise, which is one of the nice features of this particular gun vise. That looks pretty good. Now I can check the scope. Normally, I would just put the level on top of the turret. That's how I've done it for years. But Mike at Swamp Fox has pointed out that the cap covering the dial is not always perfectly parallel to the guts inside the scope. So I am going to actually take this turret off. And if you have capped turrets, obviously you would want to take those off before you do the leveling. And now I can put the level directly on this guy right here. Okay. Now I can adjust that. Okay, that looks like it's level. Now I'm going to go back and check the rifle again and make sure I didn't bump the rifle. I was adjusting the scope. That is still level. Now I can torque down the scope rings. The torque spec for the rings is always going to be much lower than it is for the base. You really want to be delicate with these because, again, if you torque them down too much, you can damage the scope. Now again, I'm going to go in kind of an X pattern, except this time I'm not actually torquing all the way. This time I'm going to do 2 on one ring and then 2 on the other ring. I'm going to get them really close to where they're almost at their torque. Almost at 10 pounds. You can kind of feel the torque driver getting close. Then I'll come through for one more final pass. Again, I'm checking my gap to make sure it's about the same on each side. All right, there we go. Okay, the scope is now mounted. The last thing I will do is make some witness marks with my paint marker or nail polish. And I'm just gonna make a little line or a dot on each screw and then right next to the screw. And that way I will be able to tell if the screw starts to back out. The marks will no longer line up with each other. It's a little tricky on this one because the screws are down in this little recess, but I think we can make that work. And then I'll also do it here on the mount screws. Just a little mark, that's it. So if the screw starts to move, it will become apparent. A lot of times at the range, if I get flyers or if I start losing zero, it will be because the mount is loose, and I can just glance at those witness marks to see if that is my culprit, and that'll tell me whether the mount is something I can rule out when I'm troubleshooting. Next time, we are going to go out to the range and sight this thing in, so keep an eye out for that in the next week or two. I hope you guys have found this helpful so far. If so, please hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. That helps other people find out about our videos here at Lucky Gunner. We just hit 400,000 subscribers a couple of weeks ago, which is a big milestone for us. Huge thanks to all who helped make that happen. Another big thanks to those who have supported this channel by purchasing ammo. I know there is not always a whole lot to choose from right now, and I know a lot of you are still waiting for the supply chain to calm down a little before you start buying again, and I totally get that. Honestly, we are dealing with a lot of the same issues, just on a bigger scale. And no, there's not a vast government conspiracy. We are just still in a period of unprecedented demand for ammo, and the big companies are having a hard time keeping up. So we are doing whatever we can and using whatever sources we can find. We just bought a whole bunch of steel cased 9mm from some Turkish company I've never even heard of before, and we paid an arm and a leg for it compared to what we would have paid back in 2019. That's been pretty par for the course over the last year, so thanks for bearing with us. Hopefully the market will start returning to something close to normal in the near future. I don't know though. In the meantime, I will keep making videos if you keep watching them. I'll see you soon.